Hello again, friend. Settle back into the silence of our space. Let the deep quiet of the moment wash over you, calming every muscle. We are arriving at the point of no return, the final fatal moment in our story. The greatest political drama of the ancient world is about to reach its conclusion. Feel the quiet tension in the air, the cold, heavy certainty of destiny. The most powerful forces of the world are now aligned, ready to collide. Let the outside noise fade away, and let your mind drift towards the chilling shores of Greece. The final chapter of the Roman Republic is about to be written in blood and salty sea foam. Listen closely to the coming storm. Scene 1, the omen of winter. The winter that preceded the decisive battle was a chilling, dark omen of coming disaster. Imagine the persistent, cold, relentless rain, a constant pitter-patter against the sodden canvas tents. The ground has turned to thick, clinging mud, making every step a struggle. Antony's mighty force, once a shining symbol of the East's irresistible power, was utterly trapped. They sat immobile, stuck in the deep, waterlogged Bay of Actium. Agrippa's swifter, smaller fleet had expertly blocked the narrow sea lane. He had severed the vital supply lines that were the lifeblood of the vast army. The constant dampness brought creeping, consuming sickness. Listen closely. You can hear the soft, shallow, hacking coughs of the Roman legionaries in the darkness. The smell of unwashed bodies, wet leather, and stagnant water filled the air. Hunger, disease, and the corrosive effect of sinking morale began to slowly consume the great army. The sheer, unmanageable size of the force became its terrible, fatal liability. Every passing day, every drop of cold rain was a quiet, demoralizing victory for Octavian. The ring around them was tightening, slow, silent, and entirely inexorable. The grand army was being starved and sickness-stricken before the first sword was even drawn. Scene 2. The logic of the trap. On the opposite shore, the atmosphere was one of cool, calm precision. Here reigned the cold, unfeeling efficiency of the Roman war machine. Marcus Agrippa, the genius who was Octavian's strategic mind, had woven a truly masterful web of blockade. Imagine him standing over a large, smooth, sand-dusted map of the coast. His finger points calmly, precisely, to the key choke points he has already seized and fortified. He avoided a pitched land battle at all costs, a contest where Antony's veteran legions were undoubtedly superior. Instead, he chose a war of slow attrition, a calm, calculated grind. His plan was not to violently attack, but simply to wait, to let cold and hunger slowly, inevitably, starve the enemy into submission. He understood that an army dies not in a day of glorious combat, but over weeks of cold, quiet despair. Listen to the soft, rhythmic sound of the tides near his command post. Every ebb and flow of the water was working in Octavian's calculated favor. Every single day that Antony's magnificent fleet lay idle and trapped in the harbor was a strategic triumph for Octavian. The sound of Agrippa's quiet breathing spoke of total, unshakable confidence. Scene 3. The Divided Council. In Antony's headquarters, the fragile silence was abruptly shattered by open conflict and desperate, strained voices. The air in the tent was heavy and thick with unsaid words and mounting, barely controlled frustration. His most experienced Roman generals, men who had marched with him for decades, pleaded with him. They begged him to abandon the sea fight entirely, to burn the now useless ships, and to execute a daring withdrawal by land. Listen to the desperate conviction in their low, pleading voices. On land, they firmly reminded him, his massive legions were still unified, still formidable, still utterly unvanquished. But Cleopatra adamantly refused to even consider it. Her voice, though soft and melodious, was unyielding, a hidden steel blade wrapped in the softest silk. A full retreat overland would mean abandoning the entire fleet and, crucially, the vast, priceless Egyptian state treasury, which was stored deep within the holds of the ships. Her ships and her gold were her sole path to safety and the continuation of her power. Antony was caught in a profound, devastating struggle, a tearing of his very soul. Should he listen to the hard, practical wisdom of his long loyal Roman officers, or to the compelling, intoxicating, and politically ruthless logic of his Egyptian queen? The ultimate, impossible choice hung heavy in the air, a burden almost too great for any man to bear. Scene 4. The sound of betrayal. The trust in Antony, that crucial, unseen foundation of his command, was beginning to crumble like old cracked stone. Night after night, in the deep, cold silence, the soft, rhythmic sound of quietly dipping oars could be heard near the water's edge. High-ranking Roman officers and powerful senators who had followed him to the east were defecting in droves. Men like Domitius Ahenobarbus silently slipped away on small, fast skiffs under the cloak of darkness. They could no longer tolerate the paralyzing, visible dominance of Cleopatra in the military decisions, nor Antony's increasingly disastrous and erratic strategic commands. Imagine the cold dread of a Roman senator leaving his great commander and his entire life behind in the terrifying darkness. Each defector was another silent, undeniable condemnation of Antony's chosen foreign path. The whispered sound of betrayal was a further, final nail in the coffin of his noble cause, and a massive psychological triumph for Octavian's cool, calculated propaganda machine. The great army was slowly bleeding morale, not from the wounds of battle, but from quiet, creeping desertion. Scene 5. The Fateful Choice. The steady, painful stream of desertions wounded Antony deeply, fueling a rising, irrational tide of paranoia and distrust. In this profound moment of weakness and fear, Cleopatra was his only sanctuary, his only source of comfort. She soothed his anger, but hardened his resolve towards the battle. Her voice, low and profoundly persuasive, filled the silence of the tent with conviction. She convinced him that the traitors were not only wrong, but cowards, and that a single, glorious, overwhelming victory at sea would instantly silence all his critics and rivals once and for all. It was a desperate, almost suicidal gamble, but one wrapped in the intoxicating, irresistible promise of immediate, total triumph. Driven by despair, by a need for quick, final action, and above all, by his consuming, blinding love for her, Antony finally yielded to her will, setting all his remaining fortune on a single, fateful roll of the dice: the naval battle. The decision was final, made with a heavy sigh, and the surrounding air seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Scene 6. The Unspoken Plan. The final preparations for the battle began under a deeply strange and profoundly unsettling atmosphere. Antony, in a gesture of desperate finality, issued a clear and brutal command to his Roman ships. He ordered the heavy, unwieldy mainsails to be completely removed from all his warships. This was a clear, terrible sign to his men. There was absolutely no plan for a retreat. Only victory or death in the open water. The heavy, resonant thump of the sails being lowered was an ominous, definitive sound. But on Cleopatra's Egyptian squadron, which was subtly positioned far behind the main Roman line, the large, vast, crimson sails remained fully operational and carefully hidden, ready to deploy at a moment's notice. This was the quiet, visible evidence of a secret, pre-planned escape strategy, a hidden contingency plan, masked by the powerful facade of the readiness for a fight to the death. The great, irreplaceable treasure of Egypt rested within those ships, the ultimate living prize, ready to flee the carnage. Scene 7. The Clash of Giants. On the 2nd of September in the year 31 before Christ, the two mighty fleets finally crashed into each other. It was a strange and terrible confrontation of sheer mass against agility, the massive, slow giants against the swift, hungry wolves of the sea. Antony's huge, fortress-like ships, the octaremes and quinqueremes, were built for sheer impact, but were agonizingly slow to turn. They moved with a slow, powerful certainty against Agrippa's smaller, much faster Liburnians. The plan was simple: to smash through the enemy line with a sheer, overwhelming physical mass. But the reality of the fighting was instant, bloody, and entirely unforeseen chaos. Listen to the sudden, distant, metallic roar as the two forces initially connected. A sound of wood and iron meeting. The sea, usually calm and blue, began to churn with the desperate struggle of tens of thousands of men. The battle instantly became a chaotic, brutal mess. Not the grand, orderly spectacle he had planned. Scene 8. The Agile Attack. Agrippa, the cold, brilliant tactician, utilized his enemy's greatest strength as its most profound weakness. He strictly forbade his captains from engaging in the deadly boarding combats, the hand-to-hand fighting on the decks. That close-quarters combat was where Antony's veteran legionaries, his land soldiers, were strongest. Instead, his agile ships danced constantly around the massive, slow-moving enemy vessels. They broke the long, fragile wooden oars of the giants with quick, sharp ramming strikes. Listen to the sickening crack and splinter of the broken wood echoing across the water. They set the decks ablaze with a barrage of flaming missiles, burning pitch and glowing oil. The dreadful, constant hissing of the fire as it consumed the great wooden hulls of the ships. The battle was quickly turning into a slow, agonizing process of attrition. A deliberate, burning, and excruciating end for Antony's massive fleet. His great ships were being transformed, one by one, into burning, floating tombs of wood and despair. Scene 9. The General's Despair. Antony himself fought with the desperate, raw courage of a cornered, dying lion. He fought side by side with his men, his face and armor covered in the grime, sweat, and blood of battle. But from the deck of his flagship, he was forced to watch his entire massive strategy collapse in flames. His mighty sea fortresses were too slow, too clumsy, too easily isolated. They were being surrounded, overwhelmed, and relentlessly reduced to smoldering, useless wrecks. The terrible, acrid smell of burning wood and oil began to choke the air, making it hard to breathe. The constant, terrifying sound of the surrounding fire was growing louder than the desperate shouting of the fighting men. The battle was slipping entirely out of his grasp, completely out of his control, and into the hands of a superior mind. The fierce belief in victory was replaced by the cold, sick, growing certainty of total defeat. Scene 10. The Queen's Decision. From the vantage point of her own magnificent flagship, the Antoniada, Cleopatra watched the unfolding total disaster. The vision of a glorious unifying victory was now a horrifying spectacle of smoke and carnage. She saw the central battle line of Antony's ships buckle and finally fracture, with no hope of recovery. All hope of winning, of taking Rome, was rapidly dissolving in the thick, suffocating smoke and flames of the shattered hulls. The moment of cold, absolute political calculation had finally arrived. She knew that her duty was no longer to the lost battle, but to the desperate, continued survival of her kingdom and her children. Her life was Egypt's gold, and Egypt's gold was on these ships. In that exact, fateful moment, a decision was made, a choice that still echoes with controversy and disbelief through all of history. Scene 11. The Sudden Flight. Suddenly, and completely inexplicably to the fighting Roman sailors, the Egyptian squadron was instantly galvanized into action. A sharp, piercing signal was given from Cleopatra's flagship, a sound of a horn or a gong. The 60 ships of her command quickly unfurled their great, prepared crimson sails. A sudden, favorable shift in the sea wind caught the sails perfectly, almost miraculously. They quickly broke through the gaps in the fighting lines and sailed directly and purposefully towards the open sea. They sped south, leaving the battle, the chaos, and the dying far behind them. For Antony's loyal soldiers, still fighting and dying in his name, it was not just a retreat. It felt like an instant, absolute, and unforgivable betrayal. The sound of the wind suddenly filling those fleeing sails was the sound of their final, terrible doom. Scene 12. The General's Surrender. Antony saw the flagship of his queen sailing away, a vivid flash of purple and gold disappearing into the distant horizon. For a long, frozen moment, he simply stood, paralyzed by total shock and utter disbelief. In that instant, Something profound and permanently vital broke within his spirit. The commander, the politician, the Roman triumvir, they all perished on the spot. He instantly, shamefully abandoned his post, his fleet, and his cherished honor. He jumped into a small, quick pursuit boat, a humble craft of only a few oars. The frantic slap, slap of the small boat's oars against the water as it desperately chased the queen. He followed her, driven by a desperate, powerful, unreasoning compulsion, a force stronger than any sense of duty, any tie to Rome. His love, his obsession, his sheer emotional dependency. He chose a woman over an empire, a tragic, humiliating flight over an honorable, glorious death. Scene 13. The crushing aftermath. The shameful flight of their commander instantly, utterly sealed the fate of the remaining Roman fleet. The leaderless ships were instantly consumed by a paralyzing, fatal panic. Some captains bravely continued to fight on, refusing to accept the sudden, crushing betrayal. But others simply dropped their weapons, their spirits utterly crushed, and tried to surrender to the nearest enemy ship. Listen to the sudden, eerie, heavy silence as the fighting stopped on a captured ship's deck. What had begun as a massive, orderly battle ended in a devastating, chaotic, shameful flight and a mass surrender. The victory for Octavian was absolute, undeniable, and completely, mercilessly devastating. Scene 14. The Voyage of Silence. Aboard Cleopatra's magnificent, fleeing vessel, the reunion of the two lovers took place in a silence colder than the sea itself. Antony spoke no single word, not even a syllable of accusation or grief. He simply sat down at the edge of the ship, his face deeply buried in his trembling hands. He was a totally broken, empty man, his pride and his entire career utterly destroyed. The constant, soothing, rhythmic hiss of the waves against the hull was the only sound for days. The profound, cold realization of his crime, the ultimate betrayal of his men, his republic, and his own honor, plunged him into a deep, silent, immovable despair. For days, he remained in that state of cold, quiet, unresponsive shock, unable to move or speak. Scene 15. The Abandoned Army. Back on the shore, 19 legions, the very flower of the Roman army, waited, patiently, desperately. They watched, in total, stunned disbelief, as their great fleet was slowly, deliberately annihilated. They waited for the command that never came, the signal for the decisive land battle. Their supreme commander, 𝐀𝐒𝐿 Crassus, learned of Antony's cowardly flight. Under the cover of darkness, he too shamefully deserted the army and fled for his own life. Imagine the silent, agonizing weight of betrayal as a general abandons 100,000 men to their fate. The fate of the world's most powerful land army was sealed, not by a final, glorious sword fight, but by a sudden, creeping loss of leadership. Scene 16. The final surrender. For 7 agonizing, desperate days, the massive, leaderless army waited, the single largest Roman force ever assembled, sitting entirely still. 7 days of silent hope and mounting, paralyzing dread passed slowly over the camp. Then, When all hope of their imperator's return had been thoroughly extinguished, they capitulated. The quiet, heartbreaking clink of thousands of weapons being gently laid down in surrender. In a single decisive moment, Octavian doubled his military strength. He was now the undisputed, unchallenged master of all Roman military power, both on land and sea. The Republic, long sick and dying, had finally perished on the water and the shore of Actium. Scene 17. A voice through despair. The long sea journey back to Egypt was a terrible, shameful passage through the hell of regret and self-loathing. Antony remained in a state of silent, distant, unbreakable apathy. Cleopatra respected his deep silence for many, many days, giving him space. Only as the familiar, sun-drenched, reassuring coast of Egypt began to draw near, did Cleopatra finally find a way. A single soft word to pierce the protective shell of his despair. Her words were quiet, low, but filled with the desperate, immediate need to survive and to plan. But the man she spoke to was a shadow, a hollow fragment of the proud, magnificent triumvir she had once enchanted. His spirit was completely gone, replaced by a profound, echoing exhaustion. Scene 18. The facade of victory. To protect her precious rule in Egypt, and to prevent an immediate, destructive inner uprising, Cleopatra resorted to one final, brilliant, desperate deception. She ordered her returning, damaged ships to be lavishly decorated with fresh laurel wreaths and glorious victory banners. Imagine the sight. A fleet sailing into Alexandria's harbor, adorned as if returning from a triumphant, crushing victory. The false, manufactured cheers of the staged welcome echoed across the water and the city. It was a glittering facade, a lie as beautiful as it was terribly fragile. This brittle act of public theatre bought her a small measure of precious, vital time. Time before the true, terrifying news would inevitably spread like wildfire through the city. Time before Octavian himself would finally, slowly, but inevitably, knock upon the great gates of her beautiful, doomed kingdom. The dream of the East has been shattered into 1,000 pieces. The great general and the queen have bought themselves only a brief, stolen reprieve. The final, tragic curtain is now slowly but surely ready to fall upon the magnificent city of Alexandria. But for now, let the sounds of the burning ships and the shouting fade into the distant, unreachable past. Let your mind become still, peaceful, and totally quiet. The heavy weight of history can now be gently lifted from your shoulders and set aside. It is time to rest now. Sleep now. Sleep deep.